Hey everybody, we just would like to let you know we're officially now on iTunes, we're also on SoundCloud, and we're also on YouTube. You can look us up at Palm Beach County Young Dems or PBCYD. If you could leave us a rating or a review or comments about our interviews, it is greatly appreciated. With the rise of Donald Trump into the Republican Party, you've seen traditional conservatives say that he doesn't represent their political beliefs and he's just a grifter. So I decided to reach out to Heather Richardson, who is a historian who wrote a book called To Make Men Free, The History of the Republican Party. I decided that I wanted to go back in history to when the Republican Party was first established, right after the Whig Party was faltering and the Republican Party was formed from that, and find out how the Republican Party's ideology had changed throughout time, because as we know, Abraham Lincoln's views were widely different than Ronald Reagan's views, and Teddy Roosevelt's views were definitely different than Taft's views. So she took time out of her busy schedule to talk to me about her book, To Make Men Free, and discussed how over time the Republican Party's ideology changed and where it currently stands now. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you. So you're a professor of history over at Boston College. What got you interested in studying history to eventually teaching it?
You know, it's funny, I didn't think I started out interested in history. What I really was interested in is the relationship between ideas and reality. It seemed to me, both when I was growing up in rural Maine and later on when I was a waitress in Oklahoma, and when I was studying in college, I studied mythology before I studied history. It always seemed to me that what people thought was happening was often more important than what was happening. And I got into history because I grew up in a place where everybody was always talking about history. You know, we live history here in Maine. But also, I was taking a course with David Donald, and I wasn't into school at all. I didn't want to be there. And I was writing a paper on the Civil War, and I sat down in the cold basement of government documents at Harvard, the GovDocs division at Harvard, and it was dark and it was cold and there was no one else there. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I read the Chicago Tribune for the Civil War years. And of course I knew how it came out, but I got totally into it, and I never ate breakfast, and I skipped lunch, and I skipped dinner. And I kept reading, and about 10 o'clock at night, the war ended. And, of course, at that point, I was very cold and lightheaded, and the war ended, and, you know, there was this incredible relief that the war was over. And I turned the crank, and the next issue of the newspaper was bordered in black, and they had shot Lincoln. And, of course, I knew that Lincoln died, right? And I knew the whole story and everything, but I lived it somehow that day. And I thought that if I could just bring it alive for other people, that they too could get the importance of the history that our country has lived and that human beings have lived, and the sort of emotional and intellectual connection to that might make a difference in the way they saw the world.
Interesting. So how long have you been teaching history?
I became a teaching assistant for, I think it was David Donald first, in 1987, and I've pretty much been teaching ever since. I got my first job in 1992, went tenure track in 97-ish, I guess. I don't really remember. I was denied tenure at my first job, went back into the academy in 2004, and I've been there ever since.
So you've written multiple books throughout your career, and your latest book that you released back in 2014 was called To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. What made you interested specifically in writing this history book?
Okay, so I have to laugh about that. I have wanted to write a history of the Republican Party, or had wanted to write one for many, many years, because I study 19th century history, and you cannot study 19th century history without studying the Republicans, because that's when they started and that's when they dominated the American government. But I taught both halves of the U.S. History Survey, and I was always fascinated by the 20th century and what happened politically in the 20th century. So I went to my agent a number of books ago, I don't remember which, and I said, I want to write a history of the Republican Party. And she said, you know, nobody's really that interested in the Republicans right now. You know, write something else. So I wrote at least Wounded Knee, and maybe a different book as well. And then after, I usually like to have another book in the works when one is done. When I called her and said, Lisa, I need another book topic, she said, you know, what about that history of the Republican Party? And I got to give her credit, because she was right. If I'd written it a decade before, it would not have captured the same things that it did when it came out in 2014.
One of the things that really caught my attention right off the bat is you open your book stating how the Constitution undermines the equality promised in the Declaration of Independence, that the Constitution doesn't prevent the wealthy from taking over the government and using it for their own benefit, which can parallel to today's beliefs of the same view. But we're talking about the age of Lincoln. So what exactly in the Constitution is controversial to where it's not preventing this issue?
Well, I want to clarify a little bit. It's not that I'm anti-Constitution at all. The Declaration of Independence was designed really to create equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, which people always scream when you talk about equality, but rather equality of opportunity. And it was designed to explain the principles by which colonials were revolting against their, at the time, legitimate government. And so it's a very lofty document in a lot of ways. And it's very different than the Constitution, which is the body of laws on which this nation was founded. And those laws, by definition, had to be quite specific. And one of the things that the Constitution does, one of the very important things the Constitution does, is it protects property. It protects the right to property. And the problem with that was not apparent at all to the founders at the time because, of course, they couldn't see what the nation was going to become. None of us can. And the problem with its protection of property is that if you rely solely on the protection of property, what that means is, say, exactly what happened in Kentucky. Theoretically, everybody who went into Kentucky after the Revolution was equal, theoretically. But, some people had a little money when they went in, or some people managed to get really good ground, or some people, lucked out and found extremely rich soil. Or there's quickly what started as equality of opportunity meant that some people had more things than others. And it was only a question of time before those people who had more than others started to monopolize the government and took it over. And what became clear after the settlement of Kentucky was that you had to do something, or the government had to do something to try to stop the concentration of wealth from taking over the government. And the founders did so initially with Northwest Ordinance, which was designed to stop the practice of primogeniture, which gave all the firstborn sons everything when a father died, which of course concentrated wealth very quickly. And it also outlawed slavery because they felt that if men could own slaves, that would enable them to concentrate capital. So they tried to address this problem in the Constitution early on, but of course that didn't work. I mean, there was still slavery in places other than the Northwest, and the slave owners eventually in the 1850s did take over the government. So when I say that there's a contradiction between the Declaration and the Constitution, it is that. One is a declaration of our founding principles, and they're the ones to which Lincoln went back in the Gettysburg Address, and the other one protects property, both of which are very important. But the problem rises when we focus on the protection of property to the point that it strangles the quality of opportunity, and that's a moment that we're in right now.
I want to actually follow up on that because you actually make a very strong case about this in your book here, is that these slave owners, they were accumulating so much wealth and through the collection of property that I believe, as you mentioned in your book, that 1% basically was controlling most of the South. And that was what the Republican Party, as it formed, made that argument, not on moral grounds necessarily, as some of them did, but on economic grounds that slavery needed to end it because it consolidated so much wealth. That really was a fascinating point, that it was basically, they argued that slavery was a monopoly and that they wanted to break up a monopoly by ending slavery.
Yes, and I would like to reiterate here that certainly some people who became Republicans were opposed to slavery on moral grounds. Abraham Lincoln didn't like it, for example. But there was also, if you will, principle and morality in what looks on its surface like an economic argument, and that is the idea that, what they're really afraid of is that as slaveholders monopolize the government, and then they move west into the new land that the country acquired in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. What they're going to do is they're going to monopolize resources, and they're going to get control of the region, and they're going to monopolize the government as well. When that happens, that means they're actually going to have the power in the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate to control the American government once and for all. And when that happens, it seems to Northerners that they are simply going to take over the country and make all of America a slaveholding republic, which, historians think is pretty accurate nowadays. So when they are opposed to the spread of slavery, some of them, as I say, don't like slavery, but what they're really opposed to is what they see as the government falling to an oligarchy that is trying to destroy equality of opportunity for regular Americans. And that's what they see as the heart of America, is that principle enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, the same one to which Lincoln points in the Gettysburg Address, that all men are created equal. And then the corollary to that all men should have equal access to resources. So it's a principled stand, but I would call it a principle of government more than a principle of morality about the moral grounds of slavery.
So you mentioned the fear of becoming an oligarchy in society. So Charles Sumner, you wrote, gave a speech in the House of Representatives warning of this oligarchy causing from slavery. But then within, I would say roughly 2 days later, I believe, as you document, he was beaten with a walking stick for giving this speech. What exactly caused that?
He was actually in the Senate, not in the House of Representatives. That's a very famous scene. That's in May of 1856, and it's kind of an interesting story. And I know Joanne Freeman talks about it in her new book about violence in Congress. But it's a famous scene. And what happens is Charles Sumner, and Charles Sumner, by the way, is kind of a jerk. You know, he's one of those guys, you know, that's always lording it over everybody about how smart he is and how he speaks Greek, and you know, he travels in Europe and all kinds of stuff. And he's really pompous and annoying. So you have to have that out there first. And he's famous for these long speeches. Famous enough that usually when he speaks, everybody kind of dives for the exits because they know he's going to go on for hours. And he gives this speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And in that speech, he's doing a number of things. But what he is doing overall is he is talking about how when slave owners come to Kansas, which has been opened under the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that's important because the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturns the Missouri Compromise, which had guaranteed that all the land above 3630 would go to free soil, to regular farmers and not to slave owners. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 overturns that law and says, no, in fact, people in this vast West that we acquired from France with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, that vast land will be decided by the people who settle it. And when that happens, slave owners cheat, basically. They participate in election fraud in the territory of Kansas. And when that happens, Charles Sumner gives this speech in which he talks about how slave owners are forcing slavery on this unwilling territory, and he likens it to the rape of a slave girl by a slave master. And he also identifies the slave master that he is tying to this event, and that is a guy who is would be sitting in the Senate, but in fact he is not in the Senate at the time. But Charles Sumner goes ahead and attacks him personally anyway. But after he does that, after this speech, a young relative of the senator that Charles Sumner attacks is in the House of Representatives, and he is famous for really nothing except the fact he has a horrible temper. And he comes up behind Sumner on the floor of the Senate, and he comes up behind him, and the desk is bolted into the floor, and he comes up behind Sumner. So he doesn't want to challenge him to a duel, which would treat him like an equal. He wants to beat him like a slave, so he comes behind him, and he beats him with a stick made of that, it's called gutta percha, but it's like that heavy, heavy black, slightly bendable stuff that nightsticks are made of. And he beats him around the head and shoulders with that, and he actually slashes his head to the bone. Those wounds are later going to get infected. And Sumner tries to fight him off. Sumner's actually a big man, and he actually stands up. He wrenches the desk out of the floor in his attempt to fight back against this attack. But it doesn't work. He ends up in a welter of his own blood on the floor of the Senate, and Democratic senators have been standing there watching this happen. So when news of this gets out and gets around to the North, like, lots of people don't like Charles Sumner. He's an easy man not to like. But imagine your senator being beaten almost to death for representing your interests on the floor of the Senate, while other senators stood there and watched. And so the guy who beats him up resigns because, you know, it's actually not good form to beat a colleague almost to death on the floor of the Senate. And he resigns. He goes back to South Carolina. He's from South Carolina. And they re-elect him to the House of Representatives. You know, they're saying, this is great. We love the fact that you beat this guy up. And this becomes a real symbol for Northerners of the idea that the slave power, as they call it, the slave owners who are running society in the South and running the government, are so determined to destroy democracy that they are literally willing to kill a Northern representative in order to get their way. And that's why the caning of Sumner, as it's known, becomes such a really huge deal. And Sumner is actually too ill to return to his seat for a long period of time, and the Massachusetts, where he's from, re-elects him in absentia to his seat, even though he's not able to hold it. And his desk sits there empty as a reminder of the fact that slave owners will stop at nothing to get their way.
One of the things that really was interesting about your book is that throughout the book you talk about how Wall Street, basically, as we know it nowadays, I'm pretty sure it wasn't labeled that back then, but how much influence they had on politics. And again, it correlates with today's society where it's constantly derided about influence Wall Street has, but in the early days of the formation of this country and government, the Treasury had to keep going to them to, fund the country. So you talked about how Lincoln had to form this delicate balance between the rights of people while also trying to get favorable policies for Wall Street. So that was really interesting that you documented that.
Well, it makes sense. Lots of people look at what they think of as a democracy, and they insist that it's all about the people. And as Alexander Hamilton pointed out way back at the beginning, you can't really have a stable society unless people who have money buy into it. The problem, of course, is when they get too much power, and that's exactly what happened when the war broke out, when it was not, there was a Wall Street and people did trading on it at the time, but it wasn't known as Wall Street the way it is now. But when the war breaks out, the Union Treasury is in terrible shape. It's virtually running on fumes, and they know they got to do something because there's this war going on. All of a sudden there's a firing on Fort Sumter. Congress is not in session, and somehow they have to come up with money to put men in the field and to feed them and to get them to where they need to be. And so the first thing that happens is the Secretary of the Treasury goes to bankers, and he says, the government's about to go under. Can you please buy bonds from us so we can afford to do this? And the bankers in New York that he goes to are like, well, we'll do it, but we're going to require a really big discount in order to do that. And he's so desperate, he does it. But when he tries to do it again, the American people get really angry, and they're like, you know what? We are not fighting this war to put money in the pockets of Wall Street. So the Lincoln administration has to come up with a new system of funding the Treasury, and they do. And what's really significant about that is it's twofold. On the one hand, they invent our first national paper money. That's initially the greenbacks, which are based only on the Treasury's eventual ability to pay. So it's completely about whether or not you believe in the government, and as a result, they fluctuate dramatically. Later on, they're going to create another kind of paper money, the national banknotes, which are actually backed ultimately by gold. It's kind of complicated, but those don't fluctuate. They stay at par. And just as an aside, if you've ever wondered about the populists and the Silverites and all the fights that go on in the late 19th century, they are solely because there were those two creations of money, one based only in the Treasury's willingness to pay and the other based on gold. But when that happens, first the Treasury turns, as I say, to the greenbacks to put the power of the people behind the Treasury. But then it actually starts to sell bonds directly to the people rather than selling them through the banks, which is what had happened before. And at first they do that, and they're really iffy about it, and as a result, the government doesn't really have any mechanisms for selling those number of bonds. And so what they do is they hire a young, hungry banker from Philadelphia named Jay Cook to sell those things and to sell them to the people everywhere. And he says, listen, I will take it on myself to advertise, to have agents, to do all that, so long as you give me a percentage of what I sell. And it sounds like a really good deal when he offers it because the government's got nothing. But of course, that's how Jay Cook makes all his money. He ends up making a huge amount of money from it. But by the end of the war, what has happened is American finance is dependent largely on the people rather than on the bankers. Now, that's going to switch in the 1870s again, but it's worth remembering that going into the war, most American bankers were Democrats, and they worked with the slave owners because that's where the huge money in the country was. And so they're not convinced they're going to be loyal when the war breaks out. And in fact, New York City makes a pretty strong effort to support the Confederacy at first. That's going to fall apart. And of course, New York City is going to support the Union. There are going to be dramatically violent conflicts during the war in New York City, in part because of that earlier conflict. But it doesn't look at first like bankers are going to be on board with this. And so the Republicans come up with a new system of funding that turns the country back over to the people. And that's a really, really big deal that happens. People tend to think, oh, money, I don't care, it's a boring subject. But what it really signals is that the power of the U.S. government is going to be drawn from the American people. And at the same time, the U.S. government is going to make an effort to support regular American people rather than people at the very top. It's one of the crucial shifts of the war that a lot of people don't actually notice when they're looking at the larger contours.
One of the things that you document throughout your book that's rooted in Republican ideology is that they're against redistribution of wealth, but they're also for a fair role in the economy, that everyone should have a leg up. So how does that exactly go together? Because it sounds like it's two opposite matters. They don't want too much wealth concentrated, but they don't want to redistribute this wealth.
Well, do remember that they're coming out of an era in which most people work in some kind of an industry which they work directly with resources in nature. Most Americans in the 1860s are still farmers or fishermen or loggers or doing something that enables them to apply their labor directly to a natural product and then to market that good. So the heart of the Republican ideology, when it's really articulated in 1859 by Abraham Lincoln, is that they see the world sort of like a web, is how I always picture it. While the Democrats have always sort of been about the haves versus the have-nots, or the have-nots versus the haves. They sort of see the world as a binary. The Republicans saw the world as a web, and what they believed was that if you supported the men at the bottom of the society, the guys, the hardworking guys who were just starting out, the guys who were applying their labor to wood or to the oceans or to the fields or to the mountains digging out gold, if you supported them, their labor would produce more value than they were able to consume. Now, by the way, this is the exact sort of place that Karl Marx started, and lots of people hear that and think, oh, Lincoln was a Marxist, or, oh, are you saying Lincoln was a Marxist? He was not. They are both struggling with the rise of an industrialized economy. So they start in a lot of the same places. They don't end up in the same places at all. But the idea is that if you apply your labor to some product of nature, you're going to create more than you can ultimately consume. And what's going to happen then is you're going to have capital, and they literally call capital pre-exerted labor. And that capital is going to support merchants, for example, the next tier up of society, who, if they work hard, will in turn produce more than they can consume. That will put at the very top of society, a few industrialists, some financiers, and they in turn will employ people at the bottom. And it becomes a web in which if people at the bottom do well, people at the middle do well, people at the top do well, and in turn people at the bottom do well. But the trick to it is to believe that there is what the Republicans called a harmony of interest among all people in society, all men if they're talking about, and there's a harmony of interest among them, so that if one does well, everybody else does well. And for the Republicans, that meant supporting people at the bottom with things like the Homestead Act and the Department of Agriculture and the land-grant colleges that gave regular guys an education even if their dads weren't wealthy, and the Union Pacific Railroad that took people west. They wanted to support people there at the bottom to increase production in society. Now, the problem with that is that it sounds very good on paper, but during the war you do in fact get the concentration of a number of industries because you have this national money for the first time and people are able to operate efficiently across state lines. And because the U.S. government contracts to supply the military largely went to big producers, because realistically if you need 20,000 mule shoes, you're not going to go to Joe down the street. You're going to go to a company that can produce 20,000 mule shoes. And the same is true with rain slickers and guns and hardtack and all the things you need to be able to field an army. That meant that a number of corporations become bigger and bigger and become wealthier and wealthier based on contracts that, of course, are paid for by tax dollars. So by the end of the war, you've got a lot of regular people who have fought the war saying, wait a minute, why do we have people like Andrew Carnegie, who made a fortune during the war? Why do we have this growing inequality in American society? We need to adjust this. And a number of Republicans say we need to adjust this too. But that's the moment in which people who have money jump in and say, whoa, 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 the Constitution says you're going to protect property, and you're talking about a redistribution of wealth, and that's not okay. And that whole Republican consensus really begins to break apart immediately after the war, but it really hits the rocks in 1871 or so.
Your book documents the change in ideology throughout the years of the Republican Party, and one of the things that really kind of caught me off guard and it was really interesting was that the early change in ideology were called liberal Republicans, but the liberal Republicans were not what we would consider liberal nowadays in modern times. They were, in fact, the complete opposite of that. So why did they label themselves as liberal Republicans? Did liberal mean something different back then?
Yeah, that's a great question. It did. Liberal, traditionally, the word liberal has traditionally focused on the individual, and it has called for a small government that doesn't impede the individual, that doesn't crush the individual. So when you talked about being a liberal in 1872 or a liberal Republican, what you are saying is the government is getting too big. We want to make the government smaller because that will give people more liberty and they will be able to lead their lives as they wish. So liberal meant keeping the government small in order that individuals could act as they wished. That changes its meaning dramatically in the era of Teddy Roosevelt. The reason that Teddy Roosevelt is so important in our understandings of government, he's important for a lot of reasons, but he's important in our understandings of government because he recognized that with the rise of industrialization, with the rise of these massive factories overseen by, for example, Andrew Carnegie, the Homestead Steel Mill, which covered acres of land, and with the rise of increasingly ill-paid wage labor, that in fact the government did need to step in to protect individuals. That is, rather than having a small government to protect individualism, you needed to have a large government to protect individualism. That is, the government needed to protect mothers from feeding milk laced with tuberculosis to their children. So it needed to regulate milk. It needed to make sure that food was pure. Again, in the late 19th century, the first Food and Drug Act is 1905, so there's nobody overseeing the quality of your food, and literally unscrupulous candy dealers would paint candies in bright colors, but those bright colors were lead paint. And you can't protect your family. You can't be a good individualist if you have no control over these larger forces. You can't be a good worker if you're going to lose your arm in one of the factories because nobody's bothering to inspect the machinery. So that meaning of the word liberal changes under the Teddy Roosevelt administration in that era to mean we believe in the individual, we believe in the ability of all, and not just men at that period, some people are actually talking about women, but let's say all men to rise. But we recognize that they can't do that unless we put some checks around unfettered capitalism, because left alone, we know now, because we're seeing it happen, the capitalists will pollute all the rivers and they will literally, pump poisons into people's homes, and they don't care if people die. And you can't be an individualist if you are, literally unable to protect your very life. And that's when the word liberal means government needs to do that for individuals so they can rise. It's a really important linguistic shift, but it's also a definitional shift that is important to understand the whole sweep of our history.
So we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt here, and Teddy Roosevelt is known as coming in and busting up these trusts. But as you document in your book, you talk about that wasn't his original intent or his plan. His original plan was to come into government. Well, actually, I should back up here for a minute. So Teddy Roosevelt went, fought the war, and then he came back and he was elected governor of New York, and he was very popular. And you mentioned in your book that the Republican ideology, as we're talking about here, was kind of split in the party, and the old guard that was more in favor of big business wasn't exactly big fans of Teddy Roosevelt. And so in order for them to quash his voice at the time, they decided to throw him into the role of vice president, because that was a role that they felt very important, which was really interesting. So as we know, McKinley was assassinated early into his presidency, and Teddy Roosevelt became president. And so he decided he wanted to regulate big business, and that was what his promise was. And that the old guard Republicans that were in control of Congress, because Republicans controlled all three branches of government, as you document, were just kind of laughed at that, and they just shrugged him off. They wouldn't move a muscle to help him with this. He wasn't looking to break up these companies, but make them more transparent to the American people. And so you mentioned that probably about 5 months into this presidency, he decides, after Republicans have decided in Congress not to do anything about what he's asking, he decides to go on this trust busting. His original intent was just to regulate business, not break them up, if I'm understanding that?
Yes. So he's a big admirer of Abraham Lincoln, and he looks around him in the late 19th century and he says, this is not the world that Abraham Lincoln fought for. This is not a world in which people have equality of opportunity. I mean, literally in New York City, you've got people working in sweatshops, you've got, whole families crammed into single-room rooms in tenements. And he's looking at that and he's saying, this is not a democracy. You can't run a country this way, because the people who are going to be coming up, the workers, the immigrants who are living under these conditions, are not going to be able to be good American citizens because they're completely stunted. They're not getting any education, they're not getting good food, they're getting poisoned, and now you're going to try and put them in charge of the republic. That's not viable. So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to make this work? And he's, a wealthy man himself, and he looks at it and he says, the real problem here is probably just that corporations probably aren't following the laws. So, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, I don't have these documents in front of me, but he says what we really need is for business businesses to be transparent. Just to be honest. And then if it turns out that they are breaking laws, we can change the laws and we can make it work somehow. And he gives his speech and the corporations look at him and they're like, yeah, not happening. We don't need you. You're some upstart, what do they call him, a damn cowboy. We don't care what you think because we control everything. And at that point, Roosevelt gets really angry and he not only mobilizes the law against the biggest trust at the time, but he also mobilizes the American people. And he says, this is not fair. This is not what America's supposed to stand for. And that's always where his great power was, because you think about Teddy Roosevelt as being a very powerful president. In fact, he doesn't accomplish a whole heck of a lot except through executive orders because the Congress refuses to work with him. It's really dominated by industrialists and people who are working for the industrialists, and they try and cut him off at every turn. And you can see him getting more and more hysterical as his career advances because he gets madder and madder and madder until by the end of his career he's basically calling for things that would seem, even today, we have not passed. For example, he's the first person publicly to call for public health care in the country, but a number of other things as well. This is when he gives his Armageddon speech in the new century. But really, he's pushed to that position, and he's pushed to that position because, going back to what I said earlier about the Republicans, he really believes in the concept of American democracy and in the concept of human self-determination and the idea that you need to have healthy, educated people in a country in order to make good decisions about voting, and that's the only way you will preserve democracy. He believes in that in principle, and he cannot understand why industrialists and financiers at that point, who become very active in the late 19th century because businesses have gotten so big, they need a lot of capital, and when they do that, the financiers start to sit in on their decisions. When that happens, he's like, he can't see it. He's like, why don't you understand that you are going to destroy democracy, and once you have destroyed this country, you will have nothing left. And that's what he's really trying to do, is to force people at the top of the economy to recognize that they are ultimately destroying not only the economy but also themselves. And that's really the heart of what he is up to. He doesn't really manage to do it himself entirely, as I say, because he's got the Congress lined up against him. But what he does by appealing to the people is that he builds a movement in the people. And if you look at the country in 1900, when he is elected vice president under William McKinley, McKinley is sort of the epitome of the big business Republican in the late 19th century. That's 1900. By 1912, every single major candidate running for office, and there are 4 of them, including a socialist, Eugene V. Debs, every single person running is a progressive or a reformer, or, as I say, even a socialist. Every single political character is, because the American population has come to believe that the excesses of big business need to be regulated.
There's a lot of interesting history surrounding Teddy Roosevelt, and one of the more interesting things that I find fascinating in a kind of odd way is that Teddy Roosevelt was shot. He was attempted to be assassinated and he was shot. And then he went and gave a speech. What exactly happened there, and how does a man that was shot go and give a speech right after being shot and acting like nothing happened?
Well, be a little careful there. He was shot at, and the bullet was deflected. He was hit in the chest, but he had a wad of paper. It was actually a speech, I believe, in that pocket, and it deflected the bullet. Certainly was shot. I suspect I would not be able to give a speech after that, and I'm certain he was bruised beyond telling. But this was not high-grade weaponry. I mean, for the time it was, but the bullet did not actually cause major damage. It wasn't like Reagan or, somebody who had a real, very, very serious injury and then sort of limped his way through a speech. He continued to give as powerful a speech as he would have before because he really was not grievously injured.
Okay, so what you're telling me here is that his speech basically kind of stopped the bullet from penetrating him pretty much, if I'm understanding.
Yes, the paper of the speech, yeah.
Okay.
It was a big thick wad of paper. He had something in his pocket that deflected the bullet.
Okay. So we're talking about how Teddy Roosevelt's presidency really didn't resolve in too much because he had to do everything by executive action because Congress had no interest in working with him. So Teddy Roosevelt decides to not run for re-election. And so he felt that his successor, Taft, was going to, pick up where he left off. But you write in your book that he grew disillusioned with William Taft. But what's interesting about that, and not something I quite understand here, is that you write that Taft wasn't really interested in politics per se. His view was that he liked legal matters. His main goal was to get to the Supreme Court. But that Taft actually busted more trust than Teddy Roosevelt did. And as Taft ran, for presidency, he just talked about he was just going to enact the laws that were already on the books. So what was Teddy Roosevelt's problem with William Taft?
Well, I'll be flippant and say his problem with William Howard Taft was that William Howard Taft wasn't Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt was a young man. He wanted to be in the limelight. And Taft was a heavy man, and I don't just mean physically. I mean, he loved legal decisions. He loved things that took his time. He liked to be in a room just thinking about things. The real driving political force in Taft's life was his wife. And she had a stroke, I believe it was, very shortly after he entered the presidency, and he was just like gobsmacked. He's like, what do I do now? You know, I've lost my lodestar. I have no idea how I'm supposed to do this job. But the real problem politically that Taft gets into is that one of the things that Roosevelt did that was brilliant was he never touched the tariff. That's a little bit of a longer discussion because the key political issue in the late 19th century was the tariff, the same way the key political issue in the present day has been taxes since the mid-1970s. And the tariff comes to embody a whole bunch of stuff. So when we talk about tariffs in the 19th century, it's a different case today, but in the 19th century when you talked about tariffs, what you were really talking about was money and culture and region and all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of stuff bound up in that, the same way there's a lot of stuff bound up in taxes today, in the concept of taxes. But the problem is, in the 19th century, is that one of the reasons you get the rise of industrialists in the late 19th century is because the Republicans, because of their idea that if you help anybody, you help everybody, they put a large tariff wall around the country. It's quite high. And what that does is it does protect fledgling industries, that by the 1880s, it also permits large industries to collude to raise prices. So if you're not an established large operator, as in you're a consumer or somebody trying to start a business, you hate the tariffs because what it does is it means you're essentially shut out of a closed group. But here's the kicker is that with tariffs, you get the rise of these big entities and you get the rise of trust. And when you get the rise of trust, people are ballistic over the idea that you've got a few companies monopolizing, say, the sugar market entirely. The sugar trust is a huge deal in America. But the problem is there's nothing in the Constitution that says that Congress can do anything about trusts because, of course, nobody imagined a trust when they wrote the Constitution. But what's in the Constitution is that Congress can adjust the tariffs. So when people get mad at industrialists, what they want to do is lower the tariff. But the problem with that concept is the Republican Party loves tariffs because they think it protects people at the top, and so long as people at the top do well, everybody else will do well. But the problem with adjusting the tariffs for everybody else is that everybody hates tariffs that benefit someone else, but they like the tariffs that benefit their own district. So the problem with dealing with the tariff is, for the Republican Party, is that you're instantly going to start splitting the party apart. And Teddy Roosevelt knew that, and he never touched the tariff. He went after trust, he went after establishing national parks, he went after progressive legislation, he did all kinds of stuff, but he never touched that third rail. The first thing Taft does is he says, I got an idea, let's fix the tariff. And once he does that, the party just starts to bicker uncontrollably. And when that happens, Teddy Roosevelt takes one look and sort of slaps his head and goes, oh, for God's sake, what are you thinking? And then the next thing is that Taft personally, it's a very long story, I'm not going to bore you with, he personally attacks a deal that Teddy Roosevelt has done, and Teddy Roosevelt has a personal stake in that deal. And when Taft goes after that, Teddy Roosevelt gets furious and turns against him. So, again, on paper, Taft looks like kind of a junior Teddy Roosevelt, and he almost looks like he does more than Teddy Roosevelt in terms of trust busting. But in reality, Taft's presidency really devolves into a bit of a mishmash pretty quickly, and there's no way for Taft really to extricate himself from that because with his dislike of the public, his dislike of speaking, his dislike of getting out there and scrapping, he never manages to get the public behind him in any way at all, and Teddy Roosevelt simply comes back and takes up all the oxygen. So, you know, it really becomes the Teddy Roosevelt show again.
Since we're on the Teddy Roosevelt show here, as you're calling it, which is kind of entertaining here, so Woodrow Wilson comes in because Teddy Roosevelt decides to rerun for president because of his disgust and William Howard Taft, as we're talking about. So now we're talking about the 1912 election. And so Taft is on the ballot, Roosevelt's on the ballot, and now Woodrow Wilson is on the ballot. And of course, Teddy and Taft split the Republican votes, which paves way for Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. And Woodrow Wilson is known for bringing in the progressive era, which a lot of these policies Teddy Roosevelt was for. But Teddy did not like Woodrow Wilson, because what I didn't quite understand here is that Woodrow Wilson is enacting the policies, for the most part, that Teddy was advocating for. But Teddy hated him. Was this partisan, or is this just ego that someone was doing this, not Teddy?
Well, I gotta say, every discussion of Teddy Roosevelt has to start with ego. There's probably an apocryphal story that when the typesetter went to set his autobiography, he had to order more capital I's. But that being said, there are a number of issues going on with the election of Woodrow Wilson. First of all, Woodrow Wilson is a Southerner, and people always associate him with New Jersey, where he sort of spent his adult years. But he actually spent his childhood, his father was in the Confederate Army, and he actually grew up in the 1870s very close to the South Carolina State House, where the ultimate trauma of political Reconstruction played out. I mean, almost within stone's throw of his house. So the ascent of a Southerner to the White House was a really big deal when it happened in 1913. And Northerners were prepared to dislike him on that alone. Teddy Roosevelt's prepared to dislike him because he's not Teddy Roosevelt. Northerners are prepared to dislike him because he's a Southerner. By the way, there's a lot that goes along with that Southerner part. Obviously he's unbelievably racist, and he, segregates Washington, D.C., which had been desegregated since Reconstruction, and he does all sorts of things like that. But there is another piece to it, and this piece is really important for today, and that is that I said that Taft said he was willing to wiggle around with a tariff. Woodrow Wilson sets tariff reform at the centerpiece of his agenda. And before Congress is even supposed to be in session, as soon as Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated, he says, we're going to lower that tariff. We don't need that tariff. It's only helping the rich guys. We need to lower prices for regular workers. And he calls Congress into session, and he says, we're going to lower that tariff. And before he will make appointments to office or anything, he sort of demands loyalty from a lot of people with the idea that they're going to back his lower tariff. And they do. And what we get from that is the Federal Revenue Act of 1913. And what's important about that act is it does lower the tariff, and it makes up for that lost revenue with a new income tax. And that's where you get the idea that the Democrats invented the income tax. Of course, that's entirely wrong. The Republicans invented the income tax during the Civil War. It expires by statute in 1875, and then the Democrats try and reinstate it in 1894, and a Republican Supreme Court, with the Pollock v. Farmers and Loan decision, says that the government does not, in fact, have the power to tax with an income tax. And even William Howard Taft is like, oh, come on, of course we do. We did this ourselves during the Civil War. And that's how we get the amendment that Taft signs just in time for Woodrow Wilson to put it into practice. But you can just imagine how Republicans felt about, first of all, the lowering of the tariff, and second of all, about the new income tax that goes into position in 1913. And so Woodrow Wilson has lost key Republicans, notably Henry Cabot Lodge, before really anything has happened. That first thing just drives Republicans batty. And you will see that even today. You will see in the darker regions of the Internet people talking about how the Federal Revenue Act of 1913 was unconstitutional, and it was the beginning of the slide downhill. That still has that kind of conjuring power because it was such a huge change. And that right there divided the lines between Woodrow Wilson as a progressive and Taft and Roosevelt as a progressive, even though it looked on the ground as if they played out fairly similarly. There's also a big political shift in that era because Republicans in the West actually like Woodrow Wilson, and they like Woodrow Wilson's policies. And you're going to see during the Wilson administration already people in the West beginning to slide away from their former allegiance to the Republican Party and start to entertain the idea of working with Democrats. And that, of course, FDR is going to capitalize on not only in 1932 but also in 1930 as they're trying to build a Democratic coalition to stand against the Hoover Republicans.
All right, so we know actually after Woodrow Wilson goes for election for 2 terms.
Yeah, he's reelected in 1916.
After Wilson goes for 2 terms, I want to get to the Coolidge administration here. Calvin Coolidge comes to presidency after Harding. And what amazed me, because I didn't know this, and your book informed me of this, and the open corruption kind of reminds me of what we're facing right now, is that Hoover was in his administration where Hoover ran the Department of Commerce, and Hoover worked with big businesses to avoid antitrust suits. And that was insane, but that, I guess, goes along the Republican ideology of that they don't want government involved, they just want businesses to run. And again, that kind of correlates with modern times here, where there shouldn't really be much of a government, it should just be business. Let government be run by businesses. But the thing that really caught me off guard was how the Secretary of Treasury Treasury, Andrew Mellon, this very wealthy man, was going out in public and giving these large speeches saying that we need to lower taxes and that the reason why wealthy men find loopholes and find ways to not pay taxes is because taxes are so high, and that if you lower taxes, they will pay their taxes. Well, in the background, he was going to the IRS and talking to them and finding ways that he could avoid paying taxes, even as he was looking to lower taxes. And that's just amazing. And it's mind-blowing how this was happening. And again, we kind of see it with what's going on nowadays. And I don't understand how no one was in an uproar about this. Did people not realize that Mellon was doing this and Hoover was doing these things?
Oh, sure. People were in an uproar, but they didn't recognize that these shenanigans were going on, for sure. But, the 1920s are a time of extraordinary intellectual ferment and artistic ferment in America. If you think about it, you've got John Dos Passos writing, and you've got the Harlem Renaissance, and you've got, a lot of people saying, hold on, this is not my America. You also have a lot of people who are doing very well in this, or seemingly doing very well in this economy, and they're loving it. You've got radios, and you've got nylon stockings, and you've got all sorts of new products in the household, dishwashers, and things that people feel like this new economy is doing them incredible favors. What I like about the 1920s, and what I think is fascinating about them and different than the present, is that there really is an ideology behind them. That is, it's very easy for us to sit here today and say, these guys were corrupt, they were stealing everything, this is a terrible thing. And we know that. Of course, we know that when the whole thing crashed and the cover was ripped off, we could see it. But you can't judge them on that in the 1920s. And the reason I'm fond of the 1920s is because it's the last period where I almost ironically see purity. That is, people like Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover, by the way, was a brilliant engineer. I have a lot of problems with Hoover, but I always feel like he kind of is a man who got, like a fly caught in amber. He was in the wrong place at the right time, or something like that. Anyway, in the 1920s, Republicans really believed that the secret to creating an incredibly prosperous modern economy was getting rid of the government, because individuals knew their best interests. And if you only got rid of the government, that businessmen would run their businesses in such a way that it would be the best for everyone. And the trick is that that's the language people use today. For sure, you hear people like Paul Ryan saying that. But we now know that's not true. They didn't know it wasn't true in the 1920s. And you can tell they didn't know it wasn't true because they boasted unbelievably about how this was it. They had solved poverty. They had solved morality. You no longer needed any kind of reform organizations because their system of the economy was so fabulous that it was going to mean that you weren't going to need any kind of social welfare systems anymore because everybody was going to have plenty of money. And they're bragging about it. They're saying, we finally did it. We got rid of all those awful Democrats who don't understand how the economy works. And there's a reason that they argued the Democrats didn't know how the economy worked, and that's its own story. But we finally got rid of all the Democrats. We're in complete control, and by God, look how well we're doing. And then, of course, when everything collapses, and the economists have given us the reasons that everything collapsed, they're like ducks who've been hit on the head. They have no idea what happened. And all they can do is say, we just should have done more than what we did, And that's where you get Hoover and later on his acolytes like Robert Taft, who is William Howard Taft's son. He's a senator from Ohio, saying, the New Deal is crazy. We need to get rid of all those things. The problem with Hoover and the problem with Coolidge and the problem with Harding was that they had too much government, even though they had slashed it absolutely to the bone. We need to get rid of public school teachers. We need to get rid of cops. We need to get rid of all that because you need to pay for them with tax dollars, and those tax dollars make businessmen insecure, and as a result, they're not investing enough, and that's why the economy collapsed. We now know that's wrong, but they didn't know it was wrong at the time. So when I look at the 1920s and how much it looks like today, I almost feel nostalgia because it's like, oh man, you guys are incredible thieves and you're really about to hit the wall here, but I really think they're honest about it. For me, the breaking point is the Depression, because when you come out of the Depression, you have to know that system doesn't work. And anybody after the Depression and in the era of the New Deal who continues to argue that the solution to creating a vibrant, equal economy is to slash government and turn it over to business is lying. They know that's not true. We know it's not true. We know they are simply selling people a narrative that is a fantasy. And that's why I am so angry about where the Republican Party ended up after the rise of movement conservatism, because Eisenhower got it. Nelson Rockefeller got it. The Republican Party understood that they needed to reform, and they did. And they were incredibly successful. And then a very small cabal of industrialists managed to overturn that by using their money to promote a narrative that was simply false. And now, 35 years later, we're reaping what they sowed, and it's really ugly, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I'm fond of the 1920s because I feel like they were honestly corrupt, if you will, and that we no longer have with us. So even though it looks the same on paper, I kind of have a little bit of nostalgia for that avaricious innocence, if you will.
I want to stop you right there because I like that enthusiasm that you're fond, because they were corrupt, but at least they were honest about it. So I get what you're saying, but it's kind of funny.
Yeah, I don't like hypocrisy, and I really don't think Hoover was a hypocrite. I don't think Calvin Coolidge was a hypocrite. Now, I actually kind of like Hoover personally. I mean, from their papers. I loathe Calvin Coolidge, but they weren't hypocrites. What I don't like are hypocrites, and I think what we are dealing with in the present is hypocrites.
So you mentioned how Eisenhower got this vision that you needed government to work, for everyone. But didn't Eisenhower run his campaign about ending the New Deal, and then got into office and realized that was just political suicide, and then just found ways to moderate it?
If he did, I don't know it. Where are you getting that from?
I was thinking that I read that in Kevin's book.
Kevin Cruz's?
Yeah.
So here's the story with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a deliberately thinks-like figure. Eisenhower was a very, very smart man. And he often played issues in ways that are hard to understand today. So that being said, there are many times when you can look at Eisenhower's activities, say, for example, over the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954, which was intended to end segregation. And many people look at that, many of my friends look at that and say, oh my God, he was such a racist, he did so little. And I look at that, because he said to people he wished that it hadn't been written the way it was, and he wished it hadn't been done. I look at that and I say, Eisenhower was the guy who put Earl Warren on the Supreme Court. And everybody knew that Earl Warren had been interested in the Lemon Grove decision in California earlier that outlawed segregated schools for Mexicans. He knew that the decision in the Lemon Grove incident outlawed desegregation, and he deliberately chose Earl Warren to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court with the idea that Warren's chief power was he was a politician himself, he's a former governor of California, was in building coalitions. So my point here is that Eisenhower often looked like many different, he was sort of protean. But that being said, if you look at what he did and the way he talked, the whole reason that Eisenhower ran for office, for the presidency in 1952, was that the leading contender for the Republican nomination was Hoover's protege, Robert Taft. And Robert Taft wanted to end the New Deal, and he wanted to take America out of NATO. And Eisenhower firmly believed that America needed to participate in NATO, and that America had a duty to the world, having introduced nuclear weapons to it, to guarantee that those nuclear weapons would not be used. And his idea for making sure that they weren't used was the idea that if you managed to, the way that demagogues got power was to take populations that had been destabilized by economic changes or cultural changes or religious changes or demographic changes, and convinced those people to hate another group, hate somebody, and to tell them that they could regain power if only you got rid of those people. And who those people were didn't matter. But what an authoritarian figure would do under those circumstances was to consolidate a following that would enable him to take power, whether religiously or politically or ethnically, and become a demagogue. And with that kind of authoritarian power, he would be able to use nuclear weapons and destroy the earth. So Eisenhower firmly believed that America needed to be involved in the world and needed to guarantee that everybody across the world had a rising standard of living, so that you would sort of pull the plug on anybody being able to create a demographic that would follow an authoritarian leader. And I think Eisenhower's been borne out. If you look at the movements, the religious movements and the ethnic movements and even political movements around the world since the 1970s. You get these populations that are willing to follow demagogues because they're hoping for some kind of a way out of a situation that they feel doesn't sufficiently value them. But anyway, so Eisenhower deliberately runs against Robert Taft, and there's actually a fist fight at the convention because the Taft people believe that Eisenhower has stolen the nomination, with the help of an Eastern elite. That's where we get the idea of the Eastern elite, because especially Massachusetts Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. managed to throw the nomination to Eisenhower rather than throwing it to Taft, because Taft is an isolationist and they recognize that that's a real problem in the post-war years, but also because they recognize that Taft is determined to destroy the New Deal, and Eisenhower's not going to do that. What Eisenhower does is he comes up with a different version of the New Deal that he calls the middle way. And with that, he is essentially trying to give more power to businesses than the Democrats under FDR and Truman had done, but to retain the concept that the government had a duty to regulate business, to protect social welfare, and to promote infrastructure. And you can see that with Eisenhower most dramatically with the fact that he backs the largest public works program in American history, and that's the interstate highways. Those are Eisenhower's creation, and he backs them. That's not a man who's against the idea of the government being involved in social welfare legislation or in economic legislation when he is in fact promoting this very dramatic expansion of the government. He also is in favor of, for example, universal health care, and he's the one who creates an office and puts Nelson Rockefeller in office to make that happen. Of course, it doesn't happen, primarily because Southerners don't want to let African Americans have equal access to medical care as white people, but he does try and make that happen. So I don't think he's actually trying to destroy the New Deal, that he is in fact trying to maybe make it a little bit more Republican than Truman and FDR did. But this is the whole reason that we get the rise of Hoover's acolytes as the movement conservatives, is because they look at Eisenhower and they just see a different flavor of the New Deal, and they label all of those people who believe in a government that should regulate business, as I say, and promote social welfare and promote infrastructure, as a liberal government in the sense that Teddy Roosevelt used it. And this becomes the big capital L liberal cabal that William F. Buckley Jr. talks about, and it's also the liberal consensus. People now think that liberalism in that period meant Democrats or even meant socialists or communists. In fact, it meant anybody in America who believed that the government had a role to regulate business, promote social welfare, and promote infrastructure, and shouldn't simply turn the government over to business to do whatever they want. So Eisenhower, to me, is much more in an FDR mode than he is a Hoover mode, and I think he would be shocked to hear anybody call him out as being a member of the Hoover mode.
So I'll end it on this. Eisenhower gets into the presidency, and one of the people that we now know is infamous, I should say, for his vice president was Richard Nixon. And you just explained to me Eisenhower's view of America and the middle way. But we know once Nixon takes over presidency, after LBJ and Robert Kennedy were in office for the time being, from Nixon on end, they stopped believing in a strong government that believes in social welfare and regulation. And you talk about this movement conservatism. Do you see in modern times anyone in the current Republican Party that shares the beliefs of Eisenhower, in your opinion?
I see an awful lot of Republicans who share the beliefs of Eisenhower. I think that, frankly, the majority of Republicans would like to see an Eisenhower, but they're not the people who are in power. That's the kicker right there. And I think, as I've written not only in that book but elsewhere, businessmen who hated government regulation, they didn't like taxes either, but they really didn't like government regulation. They wanted to be able to do whatever they wanted, hated this liberal consensus that said the government had a role to play in the economy. And they set out to destroy that liberal consensus. And they said so. I'm not making this up, And the problem with that is that it's enormously popular. It was enormously popular in the 1950s, it's enormously popular today. And so in order to sell what people really didn't like, instead of saying, hey, we're really going to destroy your Medicare, what they said was these large government programs redistribute wealth from white people to black people. And they insisted the civil rights movement was, in a sense, a form of communism. And also the women's movement and the American Indian movement and all the people who were demanding an equal say in American society. In order to get that equal say, it was going to take government regulation and it was going to take government funding. And if that were going to happen, that had to be paid for somehow. And what they said is it was going to be paid for by taxes. And by definition, those would be taxes paid for by white people, largely by white men. So if you go down that road, you can see any kind of active government being a redistribution of wealth. And on that wedge, on the idea that government that helps out people, in fact, is taking white people's money and giving it to black people, industrialist leaders were able to take over the Republican Party. And they did so really dramatically, of course. The real switch happens in 1964 when the Republican Party nominates Barry Goldwater on a platform that basically says, let's get rid of Brown v. Board, but while we're at it, let's talk about black rights at all. We're happy to go way back in time here. And Barry Goldwater loses, but he wins Arizona and he wins 5 other deep southern states. And when that happens, Richard Nixon has to decide, and he looks at what Barry Goldwater does, and he's like, man, I got to hammer together a coalition. And he adopts what we know as the Southern strategy, by which he says to people like Strom Thurmond, who had been a Dixiecrat, a Southern Democrat, and who had switched parties in 1964 to support Barry Goldwater. He says to Strom Thurmond, who's a Southern senator from South Carolina, he says, I'm not going to touch black rights. The federal government's going to stay out of that. Do whatever you want. And it's on that the Republican Party starts to realign and starts to gain extraordinary power in the South. And once that's happened, the party has really wed itself to that strategy. It's worth remembering that Eisenhower is the first president to have a black cabinet member. I mean, he's really been trying to push black rights. And you can't get contracts on Army bases unless you have integrated under Eisenhower. There's all kinds of stuff he does. But by the time you get Nixon, they've tossed that strategy overboard. They're no longer looking at a multicultural America like Eisenhower was. They are looking at a white America. And that really takes off. Of course, Nixon goes down in flames and we get Jimmy Carter. But this is the platform on which Ronald Reagan ran. Ronald Reagan had been a big supporter of Barry Goldwater. He gives his speech announcing that he's going to run in, I believe, Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is right near where 3 civil rights workers have been murdered. And he says at that speech, I believe in states' rights. And he says the government is the problem. We got to get rid of the government. And to a lot of Americans, that sounded like a good thing. Their taxes were going up. They looked at African Americans who seemed to be getting rights they didn't have, and they thought that was a great thing. What they didn't understand was that what this really was an attack on the liberal consensus. This is when it was known at the time as the L word becomes epithet. What they didn't understand is that ideology was going to harden into the Republican Party until we got to the moment we're at now, which is in a Republican president who, and I think he is malleable himself, but he is definitely acting along the lines of this particular branch of Republican ideology. He is working to destroy the New Deal government. But just this morning we have him saying it's a great decision that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. We see him gutting the government. We see the kind of tax cuts that would have made Andrew Mellon, swinging from the treetops in glee, being enacted, blowing a hole through the deficit, which was up, I believe, 48% this year. We see him gutting the government, simply refusing to fill offices, gutting regulation, getting rid of the land protections that Teddy Roosevelt had put in place and that other presidents have put in place. And what you're seeing here is exactly what Barry Goldwater, William F. Buckley Jr., people in the 1950s were calling for. Get rid of this new concept of government. And that concept of government, the New Deal concept of government, really held in America from 1933 until 1981. And if you look at every economic statistic we have, after 1981, what had been a compression of wealth in America from 1933 to 1981 began to split dramatically. And since 1981, increasingly the wealthy have taken everything. And that's precisely what movement conservatives were expecting would happen when they attacked the New Deal back when it first happened in the 1940s and 1950s. So the direct line, I think, from the New Deal, from the destruction of Eisenhower's vision from within his own party to the present, we've lived through an epic, if you will, a political era from 1981 until 2000, I think I would say 2018, and we are just at the cusp of a new era in American history. The question is, will it be an era that is dominated by authoritarians, by an oligarchy, that same kind of oligarchy that Lincoln stood against, or will it be a new kind of progressive era one in which women and people of color really finally do get to step up to a position of equality in America. And at the end of the day, that's up to all of us, and we're just going to have to see how we play it out.
Heather, I can't thank you enough for your time. It was greatly appreciated, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Have a great day.
Yeah, take care.
Once again, I'd like to thank Heather Richardson for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk to me about the history of the Republican Party and the ideological change throughout time. You can check out her book, To Make Men Free. I've linked it on our blog. I highly recommend it. It is a fascinating read. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Thank you.